The American Civil War, April 1865. A weary general in a road-stained coat sits across a table from a man in an immaculate blue uniform. 4 years of slaughter, over 600,000 dead, have led to this quiet room in a small Virginia village called Appomattox Courthouse. There are no cannons here, no screaming men, no smoke, just 2 soldiers and a piece of paper that will decide whether the United States survives as one nation or dies as 2. But to understand how 2 American armies ended up staring at each other across a table, we have to go back, not to the first gunshot, not even to the first vote. We have to go back to the lie America told itself at its founding, that it could be half slave and half free forever. It couldn't, and the bill came due. This is the story of the American Civil War.
A house divided. By the 1850s, the United States was not one country pretending to be 2. It was 2 countries pretending to be 1. In the North, factories, railroads, immigrants pouring into growing cities, an economy built on wage labor and industry. In the South, vast plantations, a rigid social order, and an economy built entirely on the forced, unpaid labor of nearly 4 million enslaved human beings. For decades, American politicians had papered over this divide with compromise after compromise, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, each one a patch on a wound that never actually healed. Each new Western territory reopened the same brutal question. Would the United States keep expanding slavery or contain it? Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court tried to settle it permanently.
The election that broke the Union. In November 1860, a self-taught lawyer from Illinois won the presidency without a single electoral vote from the South. Abraham Lincoln had not campaigned to abolish slavery where it already existed. He'd campaigned only to stop its spread. That was enough. To Southern slaveholders, a president elected entirely on Northern votes, opposed to slavery's expansion, was proof the political system no longer protected them. South Carolina seceded first on December 20th, 1860. Within 6 weeks, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Read their own declarations of secession, and the reason is stated plainly, over and over: the preservation of slavery. Mississippi's declaration called slavery the greatest material interest of the world. This wasn't a war that slowly became about slavery. For the states that started it, slavery was the reason from the very first page. Lincoln took office in March 1861, inheriting a country that was already coming apart in his hands.
The first shot. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Fort Sumter sat on a small island, a Union outpost inside a state that no longer considered itself part of the Union. Before dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire. For 34 hours, shells rained onto the fort. No one died in the bombardment itself, but the message was unmistakable. The war had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, chose that moment to join the Confederacy rather than send troops against fellow Southerners. The Union now faced 11 Confederate states, and Americans on both sides expected the whole thing to be over in a single glorious battle. They were catastrophically wrong. The illusion of a short war. In July 1861, crowds of Washington elites rode out in carriages to picnic and watch the first major battle of the war near a creek called Bull Run, expecting an afternoon's entertainment. What they saw instead was chaos. Green, untrained soldiers on both sides broke and ran.
The Union Army collapsed into a disorganized retreat back to Washington, tangled with fleeing spectators. It was humiliating. And it was a warning nobody wanted to hear. This would not be a short war. It would not be a clean one. And it would not be won by whichever side simply wanted victory more.
A war of attrition. The Union held enormous material advantages, more than double the population, the overwhelming majority of the nation's factories, railroads, and financial capital. The Confederacy's advantage was different. It wasn't trying to conquer anything. It only had to survive and outlast Northern will to fight. General Winfield Scott proposed a strategy the press mocked as the Anaconda Plan. Squeeze the South slowly, blockade its ports, split it along the Mississippi, strangle it over time rather than seeking one dramatic knockout blow. It was unglamorous. It was also, eventually, exactly right. But first, both sides had to bleed. And in September 1862, near a creek in Maryland called Antietam, they bled more in a single day than on any other day in American military history. Over 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing before sundown. It was a tactical draw, but it was enough of a Union stand to give Lincoln what he'd been waiting for. The war changes its meaning. Lincoln had resisted turning the war into an abolition crusade, worried it would push border slave states still loyal to the Union, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, into the Confederacy. But by late 1862, he'd concluded that slavery was the engine powering the Confederate war effort, and crippling it would cripple the rebellion. 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Effective January 1st, 1863, it declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territory forever free. It didn't free every enslaved person in America. It couldn't reach loyal border states, and it meant nothing without Union victory to enforce it. But it transformed the war's meaning. This was no longer only a fight to preserve a Union. It was a fight over what that Union would be. And it opened the door for roughly 180,000 black soldiers, many of them formerly enslaved men, to enlist and fight for their own freedom in Union blue. The turning point. By the summer of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee gambled everything on a bold invasion north, hoping a decisive victory on Union soil might shatter Northern morale and win European recognition for the Confederacy. The two armies collided, almost by accident, at a Pennsylvania crossroads town, Gettysburg. For 3 days, across wheat fields, rocky hills, and a doomed frontal charge across open ground remembered as Pickett's Charge, the Confederate Army threw itself against Union lines and broke. Lee retreated south. He would never invade the North again. The very next day, over 1,000 miles away, Confederate forces at Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrendered after a brutal siege. The Mississippi River was now entirely in Union hands, splitting the Confederacy in two. 2 Confederate defeats, on consecutive days, on opposite ends of the country. Historians still call it the turning point of the war. Because after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Confederacy could still fight. It could no longer win. Total war. By 1864, Lincoln had found generals willing to match the Confederacy's endurance with relentless pressure. Ulysses S. Grant took command of all Union armies and refused to retreat after setbacks, grinding forward through horrific battles in Virginia. William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia and the Carolinas, deliberately destroying railroads, farms, and supply lines, a strategy designed to break the Confederacy's capacity and will to keep fighting. This was total war. Not just armies fighting armies, but entire economies and societies being dismantled to end the conflict for good. It worked. Confederate desertion soared. Their currency collapsed. Their armies dwindled while Union numbers only grew. The end. By April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond had fallen. Lee's exhausted army, surrounded and starving, could go no further. On April 9th, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could go home, keep their horses, avoid prosecution for treason. It was an attempt to begin healing a shattered country, rather than deepen the wound. Days later, on April 14th, Lincoln was shot while watching a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. He died the next morning, never seeing the reunification he had fought 4 years to secure. The war was over. What it had cost was almost incomprehensible. An estimated 620,000 to 750,000 dead. More American lives than every other American war combined up to that point.
The Union survived. Slavery, formally abolished by the 13th Amendment in December 1865, was dead. But the war didn't resolve everything it touched. The decades after, Reconstruction and its violent unraveling would decide how much freedom actually meant for 4 million newly freed Americans. And that struggle would echo for generations, arguably into the present day. The Civil War didn't just preserve a country. It forced America, at unimaginable cost, to finally answer the question it had dodged since its founding. Whether all men are created equal was a promise or just a slogan. The answer came written in blood at Sumter, Antietam, Gettysburg, and 1,000 smaller battlefields whose names a nation that once tore itself apart over who counted as free is still, in many ways, finishing that argument today. History doesn't stay in the past. It just waits for us to notice it's still speaking. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the next chapter of America's past is only one click away.